The big and powerful guns of the wasteland. Today we're going to be taking a look at how good have the big guns been. So if you're brand new to the Fallout series, or you just came back to it, and you're unfamiliar with what big guns are not necessarily like two-handed weapons. That's what I thought they were the very first Fallout that I played, since I played Fallout 3 and I seen small guns and big guns, and I just naturally assumed small guns were like pistols, submachine guns, stuff like that, and then big guns would be like rifles and shotguns. That's not the case though. All of those guns that I listed would generally be considered small guns. They'd be small arms, whereas all the big guns are the really big things. Rocket launchers, missile launchers, miniguns, flamethrowers, things like that. So how strong have these been throughout the Fallout games? Well, in Fallout 1, we actually only had 3 of them, and they were pretty much all 3 that I just mentioned, with the minigun, the flamethrower, and the rocket launcher. So big guns kind of had a rocky start because there isn't really that many weapons in Fallout 1, but big guns definitely have the smallest selection of weapons that you can actually use there. But that kind of begs the question, how good were each of these weapons? And generally speaking, the big guns were actually pretty good in Fallout 1. The rocket launcher actually took 2 different ammos. It was one of the few guns that had different ammos, so that was really cool. And it actually did pretty good damage upon the impact and from the explosion. There wasn't really like explosives in the first Fallout game. There were different things to buff explosives, but there wasn't like an explosive skill, so this one just scaled off of big guns. The minigun was pretty solid in Fallout 1 and would probably be your go-to weapon that you would be using most of the time, since it gave you good range, it gave you good DPS, and it could actually kill just about everything in the game relatively fast. The flamethrower actually hit really hard in the early games, but it was very short range. It only had like 5 reach in total, which pretty much every other ranged weapon had longer reach than that. Even like throwing weapons had longer reach than that. So you could be slightly further away than like melee distance and unarmed distance to use the flamethrower, but not by that much. So the flamethrower was kind of specialized. The main problem with big guns in the first Fallout game though is that you weren't really going to be getting them until the very end game. Like 2/3 of the way through, you probably weren't going to be finding any big guns. So if you've built a big guns character and have been putting a bunch of points into them, you're going to have a really tough time in the early game and in the mid game, because there just simply isn't big guns. As soon as super mutants show up, then you can get things like flamethrowers usually, and you're probably going to have to kill a couple mutants to get like miniguns and rocket launchers. You could potentially buy them. Some of the vendors do have them in Fallout 1, but they are kind of rare and they're very expensive. The ammo might cost you quite a bit too, because you either need a lot of minigun ammo, or just with the rockets, they're pretty expensive. So big guns, in my opinion, were probably the hardest to get going in Fallout 1. They were really strong late game, but overall as like a damage choice, they were probably one of the weakest, just because they don't really show up until way later in the game. Into Fallout 2, this would change up quite a bit, because we would get a whole lot more big guns. So we'd still have the minigun, although we would have 2 additional miniguns in this, where we'd also have the Avenger and the Vindicator minigun, which would be showing up in the later Fallout games as well, or at least past Fallout 2, where the Avenger minigun was basically just a straight upgrade over the regular minigun and just did more damage. Big guns also became a lot more easy to find in Fallout 2. They still weren't like an early game weapon. If you chose big guns in Fallout 2, that could still definitely work, but they probably weren't showing up until about the mid game. The good thing about Fallout 2 though is that it's much longer than Fallout 1. Last time I streamed through Fallout 1 doing just about everything, it took me about 8 hours. Last time I streamed through Fallout 2, it took me about 30 hours, and that wasn't doing all the side quests and everything. So like you have much more game to play here, so you're more likely to be getting to that mid game, and it's going to feel a whole lot more impactful than like how it would in Fallout 1, where it doesn't as much. But you'd have the minigun, you'd have the Avenger minigun, which was an upgrade. You had the Vindicator minigun, which was a different chambered minigun. This one was chambered in 4.7mm, which is a very bizarre round to actually be showing up in the Fallout universe. That is based off of a real round, and it was a caseless ammunition. We'd still have the rocket launcher, which was still very good, and the flamethrower, which was good. You could also upgrade the flamethrower in Fallout 2 to the improved flamer, which basically just gave it a slightly more damage. It was still pretty decent. I have some other big guns in this, like the M60, although the M60 was really rare, and the model isn't even really based off of an M60, it's based off of like a prototype of the M60, I guess. I'd never even seen this one. I looked it up. It was something like that. There was also the light support weapon, and most importantly, I would say in Fallout 2, there was the Bowser. The Bowser would show up again later in Fallout New Vegas, but it would be pretty heavily nerfed from what it was in Fallout 2. The Bowser in Fallout 2 is incredibly strong. Chambered in 223, does tons of damage, and big guns were actually really, really solid in Fallout 2. They were among some of the strongest builds that you could actually run, so big guns definitely got better between Fallout 1 and 2. Into Fallout Tactics, big guns would appear once again, and Tactics arguably has some of the best big guns in the game. Like, probably the best big gun in the game, if I'm being honest, because the big guns here are pretty good. They still somewhat run into the issue that we had in Fallout 1 and 2, and that's that you really can't start out with big guns. It's not bad if you want to tag them and it's not bad to have a big gunner on your team. But again, you're probably not going to be getting them for the first third of the game. You can potentially get 2 in the first third of the game. You can get the rocket launcher, which shows up in one of the early missions, although in total you can find like 3 rockets, and that's assuming that you kill the people faster than they actually shoot them, because once they shoot them, then you're kind of out of that. So more than likely you're going to end up with 1 or 2 rockets by that, and you just have the rocket launcher. The rocket launcher was really good in Fallout Tactics though, mostly because in this game it had even more ammunitions than it did in the previous game. The rocket launcher now not only had like the high explosive and the armor piercing rounds that it did before, and this would be more like sabot rounds that would be kind of like armor piercing, but it also had like the electric rounds that you could shoot, and those would do a lot of damage towards robots, and generally towards the end of Tactics you were pretty much exclusively fighting robots. Also, about 1/3 through the game in Tactics you would be running into the super mutants, and the super mutants love big guns, and they would be a really big step up from everything else that you fought up to that point. If you've played Tactics before, or if you know somebody that's played Tactics before, like the St. Louis mission, especially if you don't know some of the things that you can do during that mission, is a huge step up in difficulty. And one of the big reasons of this is because you're now fighting enemies that do have big guns. The super mutants are there. The super mutants are really tanky. They can do a lot of damage thanks to the big guns. The big guns are generally just way more damaging than the other guns you've run up across to this point, where it's like at this point the scariest things you could have ran into were like raiders and the beastmen with like AKs, or maybe like a semi-auto shotgun. Like, that would have probably been the worst case scenario. The big guns, as soon as you fight the mutants, are pretty much like double as powerful as them, and sometimes have longer range than them too. So you can get messed up really fast. The mutants generally have things like the M249 Saw, which was a fantastic gun to be grabbing early on because it didn't require that much strength. You used a super common round and did really high damage. You could also go with the M60, which was very similar to the Saw. It did slightly less damage, but you got more bursts out of it and it held more bullets. It did require a little bit more strength. There was still the miniguns in this. One of them is the other gun that you could get early on, but you had to find a trader and buy it from them, and then you had to get enough 5.56 ammo to make it worthwhile. It really wasn't worth it to go out of your way to do that, but you could. The mutants would also be carrying around the Browning M2, which was one of the best guns that we've ever seen in the Fallout games, I would say. Like, the Browning M2, the 50 cal, is very devastating. It has super long range, nearly as long a range as the sniper rifle does for effective range, but it fires in 15-round bursts and does massive amounts of damage. The Browning M2 was terrifying to run up against. It was terrifying if you used it, though, too, because it could rip apart basically anything throughout the entire game. And 50 cal rounds were not actually that uncommon in Fallout Tactics, so having somebody that was a dedicated like 50 caliber gunner was actually really good. And that's not even the strongest weapon in the game, because technically the rocket launcher could hit harder than 50 cal, although that one would probably beat it in burst damage. There was another gun that could beat it entirely, and that was the Gauss minigun, which we haven't really got in the other Fallout games. Yeah, I know there's one in like 76, but I still haven't played 76, so we're not going to acknowledge that one. The Gauss minigun in Tactics did 60 to 80 damage, had almost as long a range as the 50 cal, and fired in 20-round bursts. So this just completely annihilates anything. Into Fallout 3, we would get a return of big guns once again, and this time they would be kind of more toned down than what we got in the previous games, at least to some extent, because certain weapons would be kind of moved around as to what they're considered. And there was some standout big guns in Fallout 3, so if you wanted to go with them, you absolutely could. You still had sort of the problem of the previous games where big guns generally aren't available to you right away. Out of the weapons we got in Fallout 3, the flamethrowers were still very consistent. They still did actually really good damage, so if you wanted to use them at close range, you had a really good option there. The missile launcher was available here too, which was a good general purpose big gun. We would also get the Fat Man, which would be the first appearance that it showed up in the Fallout universe, and it was absolutely devastating. The mini nuke launcher is fantastic. That's probably the most devastating weapon we've had. I mean, the Gauss minigun is still probably the strongest big gun we've ever had, but there's no denying that launching out a mini nuke, or if you get the unique one that fires out 8 mini nukes at a time, it is absolutely devastating to anything that it hits or hits nearby. We'd also get the rocket launcher here, which was one of the funnest weapons in Fallout 3 because it could just spew out garbage, and it was actually a pretty good early gun if you wanted to go with a big guns build. Like, big guns were still pretty relevant in Fallout 3, especially if you wanted to take them early on. Like, that was kind of cool because the other Fallout games maybe not so much, although the rocket launcher was probably your best option. And then now the Gatling laser would actually be moved from energy weapons over to big guns in Fallout 3, which should make it a whole lot better because the Gatling laser has always been a solid weapon throughout all of the Fallout games, but in almost every game it's been considered an energy weapon, not a big gun. So like this time around, big guns kind of won out because they got that weapon. You're still probably gonna have to wait till like sort of end game to get Gatling lasers or Vengeance, the unique Gatling laser. Then into Fallout New Vegas, big guns would pretty much be split. There was no longer small guns and big guns. At least in Vegas. There kind of would be in Fallout 4, but there wasn't in Vegas, where they were just considered guns, and then every big gun would have to be split somewhere else, which did make some of them a whole lot better. It made certain ones maybe not as good. Like the minigun is still pretty good, but the Gatling laser is way better than it, and it's an energy weapon, and it can benefit from all the energy weapon perks, whereas the minigun can't really benefit from any of like the regular gun perks. Same thing goes with like the missile launcher now being an explosive weapon, not a big gun, and it could benefit from all the explosive perks you got. So certain weapons did get way better thanks to that split, whereas other ones didn't really change. The minigun was still perfectly viable if you wanted to use it. It was still really good. Same thing goes with like the light machine gun. If you wanted to use that one. The missile launcher did get better thanks to bigger explosions, more different ammos that you could load into it, and just like explosive resistance perks for yourself. That made it really nice. Like the presence of big guns didn't really go away. They were just sort of recategorized. So I would still say that they're very solid, at least if we're counting all of those weapons as like big guns. Into Fallout 4, we would kind of get big guns back, sort of. It was more like weapons were categorized now as like fully automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons or pistols or things like that, and we at least had the perk of Heavy Gunner going into Fallout 4. That would kind of like solidify all the weapons that were like the big guns. So this would be things like the Broadsider, which is a super fun weapon. Blasting things with a cannon is very funny. Cryolator, which was pretty solid too. That gun is pretty nice. The Fat Man, which was still very devastating, terrifying if you got it shot at you. And we did have crossover. Like the Fat Man was considered both an explosive weapon, so explosive perks benefited it, as well as the Heavy Gunner perk benefited as well. So that made certain weapons pretty strong. It also made it so like anything with an explosive effect was considered an explosive weapon. So you have the explosive perk like Demo Expert, you get even more damage thanks to that. So technically any of these could be even stronger. Things like the missile launcher and the minigun were still here too. And the minigun was going to be the very first big gun that you were getting, assuming that you were doing the quest in Fallout 4, since you get it pretty much after just getting out of the vault. You go over to Concord and then you help Preston and you get the minigun there and you get to fight a Deathclaw with it. Minigun was still very powerful and a lot of these big weapons were still pretty good. They were generally less effective, I found, in Fallout 4 than some of the other guns, though. Unless they had a legendary effect that made them really good. Like, if you got a minigun with bleed on it or something, or a minigun with explosive on it, like, yeah, it was going to be overpowered, but any full auto weapon with those effects was going to be extremely overpowered. It was the weight so much that I didn't care for in Fallout 4, just because a lot of the weapons did weigh quite a bit. And that makes it kind of difficult to want to carry around multiple of these and a lot of ammo for it, because that's probably going to be, like, most of what I'm carrying around. And that's going to be kind of a pain if I want to be like looting stuff. So in conclusion, how good have big guns been in Fallout's history? Generally speaking, they have been pretty strong. There's definitely been a lot of ups and downs to them though. And generally the early game is where they struggle the most. And I imagine that's more for a balancing reason. They don't want to be putting big guns at the very start of the game, because that does kind of make sense. It would be really weird if your first weapon was like a Fat Man or a flamethrower that you get, as opposed to like, you know, you getting those weapons later on to actually take out some sort of big threat, or they were introduced with stronger enemies that you need stronger weapons for. So tell me your thoughts on big guns. Which version has been your favorite? Thank you guys so very much for watching this. I hope that you guys enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye bye everybody.